Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, bed crimers. As always, I wish you the best. To anyone new here, a warm welcome. Thank you for checking out my channel. Let me just ask that after listening to or watching this video, if you learned something or enjoyed it, please do me a favor and smash that like button. Now, let's dig in. In episode 1, we talked about the precious human beings within the Vallow-Daybell orbit who died in 2019, namely Lori's ex-husband Charles Vallow, her daughter 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, her adopted 7-year-old son J.J. Vallow, her brother Alex Cox, and Chad Daybell's ex-wife Tammy. We also discussed many of the people who are part of this story. In episode 2, we're going to discuss the chronology of significant events in both Lori and Chad's lives building up to 2019, what I call the year of death and evil. Let's begin with when and how Chad Daybell came to claim that he had one foot in the mortal world and one in the sweet hereafter. In August of 1985, when Chad was 17, he traveled with a group of friends to Flaming Gorge Reservoir in northern Utah. The friends decided to go cliff jumping. Chad went up to a 60-foot-high cliff and leapt into the water. He said that when he hit the water, it felt like he slammed into concrete. Here's how he describes what happened next, and I quote, "A shock went through me, and I saw a white flash of light. I felt an audible pop in the back of my head, and I thought, oh no, I broke my neck. I also wondered if I had cut my forehead open, because there was a brief searing pain above my eyes. Then I realized something worse was happening. My spirit was partly out of my body. The best way to describe it is my physical body went deeper into the water than my spirit did. It was as if my spirit popped out through my head, but then my spirit knees got stuck. For those few moments, I looked around and saw an endless white plain in all directions. Then, as my body started to return to the surface, my spirit got sucked back into place." End quote. During this experience, per Chad, he crossed into another dimension and realized there was a world beyond this one. When he resurfaced, Chad said he was a changed man. He no longer cared about being an athlete, and instead he devoured church-related books because he felt he'd need that information later in life. He wrote, and I quote, "I believe that when I hit the water, my personal veil was torn open and didn't seal back up properly." End quote. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which Chad belonged to, the word veil is a symbol for the separation between God and man. It can also mean a God-given forgetfulness that blocks people's memories of the pre-mortal existence. With his veil torn open a tad, Chad said he became receptive to sensing spirits and was able to see the people and situations in the future that he needed to steer clear of. Now, you'd think if he really had this skill, he would have seen Lori Vallow headed his way, and he would have sensed the darkness that he and she together would allegedly conjure. Chad will later claim that 8 years later, in 1993, he had yet another water-related experience that, and I quote, "really threw the barn doors open, so to speak, on my interaction with the other side." End quote. Chad and his wife Tammy had gone on a family vacation in San Diego, California. While Chad was in the water at La Jolla Cove looking for shells, a massive wave came down on him. He grabbed a boulder and clung on for dear life. He said that when the wave headed back out to sea, his surroundings changed, and he found himself in the proverbial tunnel of light. The long and short of the story is, Chad claims he spoke to his deceased grandfather during this experience. Here's a photo of Chad post the massive wave. Now, Chad, at least in his mind, had the fodder to claim he'd had 2 near-death experiences. He said his personal veil was ripped open once again, and this time didn't close as much. Note that Chad doesn't talk about these alleged near-death experiences until later in life when he meets author Julie Rowe, who writes about this topic and sells a heck of a lot of books doing it. It would seem that maybe Chad saw a market in this genre and decided to, excuse the pun, put his foot in the water. Chad also, when he first published his books, said they were fiction, but later he will say that some of them are based on real-life events. Chad likely also saw Julie Rowe giving a lot of talks and selling a lot of tickets to those talks, and perhaps he saw that as another possible stream of income. Now, let's look at a timeline of other significant events in both Chad and Lori Vallow's lives. In March of 1990, Chad marries Tammy Douglas in Manti, Utah. He and Tammy will go on to have 5 children. A year later, in 1991, Lori graduates from high school. At age 19, she marries her high school boyfriend. But it's not long before the marriage ends in divorce. In 1992, Chad graduates from Brigham Young University. In that same year, Lori moves from California to Austin, Texas to begin cosmetology school. In 1993, Chad gets hit with that massive wave we just talked about in La Jolla Cove, San Diego. In 1995, Lori marries her second husband and has her very first child, a boy she names Colby. In that same year, 1995, Chad gets a job as a cemetery sexton. In case you aren't familiar with that term, as I was not, a sexton is a cemetery caretaker, which also can entail being a grave digger. Chad will later claim that it was in 1997 that he heard a voice in the cemetery talking to him, telling him, "Chad, it's time to write your first book." This prompts Chad to write his first book, which he calls An Errand for Emma. He will go on to write more books about the end of times, apocalyptic events, and near-death experiences. And eventually, he will begin puzzling together his own hybrid version of the Mormon faith. Chad's beliefs will veer way off from the actual LDS faith. Faithful Mormons who follow their scriptures are not giving light and dark ratings to other human beings, and they're not trying to cast zombies out of bodies, as Chad will later attempt to do. Conveniently for Chad, coming up with your own religion also allows you to ascribe yourself supernatural powers. Chad will go on to tell people that he can see into the future, and at one point he will predict the end of the world, which he said would occur on July 22nd of 2020. Clearly, Chad got that wrong. In making such claims and predictions, Chad was basically appointing himself as a prophet, which reminds me of these words from the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus speaks to his followers, he says, "Beware false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves." End quote. Too bad Chad's followers didn't heed such a warning. Back to the timeline. In 1998, Lori and her second husband divorce. In that same year, Lori's sister Stacy dies, leaving behind her 9-year-old daughter Melanie. In 2001, Lori marries her third husband, Joe Ryan. Joe immediately jumps into helping Lori. He builds her a hair salon within their home so that she can stay home with her kids and still work. Joe and Lori live in a 4,500 square foot mansion worth $710,000 in Texas. Look at this place. I mean, it's beautiful. In 2002, Lori gives birth to her and Joe's daughter, Tylee. The next year, in 2003, Chad's book, Chasing Paradise, is pulled from the shelves of the Desiree bookstore because of a scene in which a warrior angel swoops in, plucks up a naughty spirit by the nape of her neck, and then drop kicks her through a wall. The book buyer for Desiree Books found the passage irreverent and unsuitable for sale by the chain. In 2004, Chad and Tammy start their own publishing company, which they call Spring Creek Book Company. In that same year, 2004, Lori is on the game show Wheel of Fortune, where she wins $17,500. That same year, she participates in the Mrs. Texas pageant. She makes it to the semifinals, but not to the finals. In August of 2004, the same year, Joe Ryan files for divorce from Lori. This sets off a toxic custody battle that lasts up until Joe's death in 2018. Joe will end up spending more than $75,000 fighting for basic visitation rights to see Tylee. Lori throws every impediment she can in his way and ends up using Tylee as a pawn in the relationship. Lori's hatred for Joe Ryan made it nearly impossible for Tylee to have a healthy, happy relationship with her dad. In 2005, after her divorce from Joe and after having been evicted from that beautiful mansion, Lori files for bankruptcy. She tells the court that she needs $74,000 a year to provide food, shelter, and basic necessities for herself, Colby, and Tylee. The next year, on February 24th of 2006, Lori marries husband number 4, Charles Vallow. They get married in Las Vegas. Everyone in Lori's family, from her mother Janice to her sister Summer to her brother Alex, immediately adores Charles. Later in August of that same year, Lori claims that her ex-husband Joe Ryan was abusive to her kids, Colby and Tylee, and she says that he essayed them both. Both Colby and Joe's sister Annie Cushing will support Lori's claims that Joe was physically abusive to Colby, as in sometimes striking the child out of the blue. And while Colby still claims he was essayed by Joe Ryan, there was never any definitive proof of that, nor is there proof that Ryan ever did that to Tylee. Joe Ryan and his sister Annie spent time in foster care when they were young, and it sounds like they did not have storybook childhoods. This may explain Joe Ryan's temper. Of course, that does not justify any abuse Ryan subjected Colby to. On August 5th of 2007, Lori's brother Alex Cox, who seemed to believe everything his sister told him, assaults Joe Ryan at a place called the Kid Exchange. Now, this was a business designed as a safe place where divorced spouses could drop off and exchange their children. After dropping Tylee off inside, Joe Ryan exits the building and heads toward the parking lot. But unbeknownst to him, Alex Cox is sitting at a nearby picnic table, and he's wearing a dark baseball cap, dark sunglasses, a dark shirt, and dark pants. Sounds like he's ready to rob the place, right? When Alex sees Joe, he gets up from the table and verbally accosts Joe, saying, "Do you remember me?" Joe replies, "No, who are you?" Alex replies, "You don't remember me? I'm Alex." Joe replies, "What do you want?" Alex says, "We need to talk." And he begins approaching Joe. Joe, clearly feeling threatened by Alex, says to another person who's outside the building, "I need a witness to this." Joe tells this person something to the effect of, "This is Alex Cox. He's my ex-wife's brother." Alex, unmoved by Joe involving a witness, continues approaching Joe, saying, "We're going to talk right now." Joe responds, "We have nothing to talk about." Alex says, "Yes, we do. And this is for what you did to my nephew." At this point, Alex pulls out what Joe thinks at first is a gun. It's actually a taser, and Alex lunges toward Joe and tries to push it into his chest. Joe quickly swivels his body to the left, and the taser strikes him under his shoulder blade. He says his arms went straight up and he couldn't control them. Despite the pain, Joe starts running toward the building. Alex then tasers him again, this time in the back. Joe falls to the ground, rolls over, gets up, and keeps running toward the building. As he's tearing toward the building, Joe yells to yet another witness to this crazy scene, asking that the person dial 911. Joe also shouts this, "This is Alex Cox, and he's trying to kill me," end quote. During this attack, Joe fractures his wrist and injures his back, and these injuries will affect his health until his dying breath. Joe ends up pressing charges, and Alex is charged in 2007 for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon causing serious bodily injury. In March of 2008, Alex pleads guilty and he goes to jail. From the jail, Alex writes to a friend asking him to have his mother, meaning Alex's mother Janice, write down Joe Ryan's address. So even after landing his arse in jail for this criminal act, Alex is still gunning for Joe. Alex also mentions that it's crazy that he's in jail while a guy who essays children is allowed to roam free. Alex also says that maybe it's time for the apocalypse. I want to share some additional details about Alex Cox here. Cox was married twice, and his first wife describes him as having an oddly sexual rapport with his sister Lori. She said that Lori would sit on Alex's lap and sort of grind with him or pretend to emulate intimate acts in front of everybody, in front of the whole family. And this type of behavior, per the first wife, was normal in the Cox family home. This first wife also said that Lori and Alex's parents were very open about their sex life as well. So this was like normal behavior in the Cox home. Alex's first wife also talked about Alex engaging in something called sex tourism, which means that Alex would visit the country of Colombia for the purpose of having sex. She also said that when she and Alex were still married, he came home one day and said they needed to move because of a 15-year-old girl whose father had found something out about Alex and his daughter. The intimation is that Alex was perhaps intimate with this minor. It sounds like Cox may have had some sort of addiction to sex. I'm speculating here, but his behavior points to that, in my opinion. 4 months later, in July of 2008, Alex is released from jail, and he ends up turning this taser incident into a rather tasteless joke for his stand-up comedy routine. Yes, Alex had dreams of being a successful stand-up comic. In 2008, Chad and Tammy file for bankruptcy. That same year, Lori's niece Melanie graduates from the Air Force, and she marries a guy named Brandon Boudreaux, with whom she goes on to have 4 children. In 2009, Lori is found in contempt of court on 7 charges related to custody issues with Joe Ryan. Despite the charges, Lori serves no time in jail. This seems to be another pattern in Lori's life, her ability to circumvent the law. Based on how she acted with the cops on the day her brother Alex Cox killed Charles Vallow, Lori, in my opinion, capitalized on her looks and charisma and often charmed people, mostly men, into doing what she wanted them to do. In 2010, Chad and Tammy's bankruptcy is over. In 2011, Lori establishes her iCloud account. This account will be important because it comes into play after JJ and Tylee go missing. Lori was also due to have a court-ordered psychiatric exam in 2011, but she called in and said her sister had just had a baby in another state and there are complications. She requests that the exam be rescheduled until October. However, a psychologist there is aware of Lori Vallow's behavior and says she's a flight risk. The evaluation is scheduled for August instead, and Lori attends the evaluation, but appears to sort of beat it, meaning she isn't found to have any serious issues. Lori will manage to evade such a diagnosis a second time in 2019, when, if the police had taken it seriously, it could have saved lives, and we might not be here talking about any of these people. In December of 2011, Alex completes his probation for the taser incident, and all charges are dismissed. He's once again allowed to carry a gun. Not good for a guy who will come to be known as the family hitman. In May of 2012, JJ Vallow is born. He's a preemie and weighs just 2 pounds, 14 ounces. Because both of his birth parents were dealing with serious addictions, JJ doesn't really start out life on solid footing. However, his grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, fall head over heels in love with the little guy. And when JJ is finally released from the hospital, they take him home. So JJ's biological father is Kay Woodcock's son, and thus JJ was, biologically speaking, Charles Vallow's great-nephew. In May of 2012, Chad begins publishing non-Mormon doctrine stories. In 2013, Lori and Charles begin adoption papers for JJ, and when he's around 9 months old, JJ goes to live with them. Tylee, Colby, and Charles' 2 sons from a different marriage are excited to have this new baby in the family. You get the feeling that everyone, upon seeing JJ and meeting him, immediately fell in love with the little guy. It's so obvious that Tylee absolutely adored JJ, and it sort of seems like she took on a maternal role with JJ, as if she was sort of a little mother to him. In 2014, Chad meets Julie Rowe on the Voices of Warning message board, which is for people who believe the end of times are coming. Rowe is, as I said earlier, a successful author and speaker, and Chad ends up publishing one of her books in 2014. The book describes near-death experiences that Rowe claims she's had. Rowe quickly becomes close to both Chad and Tammy. It's right around this time when Chad says he's had another out-of-body experience, but this time his wife and kids witnessed it. Julie Rowe will later say that after this experience, Chad changed, and he started talking about near-death experiences and past lives. You have to wonder again if seeing Rowe's financial success spurred Chad on to start emphasizing his alleged near-death experiences and his visions of the future. In June of 2014, in an email to Joe Ryan, Lori, who's still married to Charles Vallow at this point, says she and Charles and the kids are moving to Hawaii because Charles just got a job there. Lori tells Joe that she'll be gone from Arizona by August, and she expresses that she wants to talk to him about Tylee and where she will live. Lori gives Joe two options. One, for Tylee to move with her and Charles to Hawaii, and for Joe to visit Tylee there occasionally. Or two, for Tylee to stay in Arizona with Joe, and for Tylee to be sent to Hawaii for visits with her mother. It's curious that Lori was suddenly open to having Joe take over Tylee's parenting. Now, Tylee was around 12 at this point, and she may have been acting out a tad as she inched toward becoming a teenager. Perhaps Tylee was becoming a little mouthy or a little harder to control. This is a normal stage of growing up. Lori will later tell a friend in 2019 that it was during the years of 2014 to 2015 that Tylee turned into a zombie. So clearly, Lori was having some sort of issue with Tylee at this point. Joe Ryan ends up telling Lori that Charles should move to Hawaii alone and that she and Tylee should stay in Arizona. Now, I would imagine Lori wasn't too thrilled with Joe's response. In July of 2014, JJ is officially adopted by Lori and Charles. In August of 2014, Chad is on a family vacation in Island Park, Idaho, near Rexburg, when he hears a voice, another voice, telling him that he will live in that area soon. Once he's home, Chad goes to his temple, and he gets confirmation that he and his family should move to the Rexburg area. However, Chad doesn't tell Tammy or their kids, at least at first. At some point toward the end of 2014 and the beginning of 2015, Lori and Charles moved to Kauai, and Tylee, JJ, and Colby all go with them. It's unclear if Joe Ryan finally just gave in and said, fine, Lori, go to Hawaii with Tylee. Maybe Joe realized that Tylee wanted to be with her mother and that she'd only be miserable if he insisted that she stay in the States. Who knows? While in Hawaii, the Vallows operate several mobile juice bars. Lori also works at the church as a youth counselor, a rather shocking gig for her in retrospect. At some point in 2015, Colby decides to move back to the States. In February of 2015, Chad Daybell has another vision about moving to Rexburg. This time, he says he heard a voice saying once again that moving there would be a tremendous blessing to his family, his children, and his grandchildren. Chad tells others that he saw in the distance a glorious city with a temple in it, a glimpse of the future. And one day at dinner with his family, Chad just suddenly blurts out, "When we move to Rexburg." The family is shocked because they have never heard this news before. But over time, the kids and Tammy start to believe it's something they should do. So Tammy starts looking at real estate in Rexburg, and they end up closing on a new home there in June of 2015. By the way, at this point, Chad was making just $2,000 a year selling his books. In July of 2015, Chad also launches a blog called cdaybell.com, which is still up if you want to take a look at it. His books are listed on it, and he talks about his near-death experiences. Sometime between 2016 and 2017, Lori, Charles, JJ, and Tylee leave Kauai and move back to Arizona. In early 2017, Lori and Alex Cox begin listening to the Preparing a People podcast. Melanie Gibb and Julie Rowe are involved with this podcast. At some point during this time, a friend of Lori's from Hawaii, a lady named April Raymond, says she notices a change in Lori and Charles' relationship. April explains that Lori seemed to feel at this point that she was religiously superior to Charles, and that Charles was not on her level spiritually. And this may be the crux of the matter for Lori. This may be why she was attracted to the notoriously uncharismatic Chad Daybell, and why she suddenly rejected kind-hearted, generous, successful Charles for Chad Daybell. Big mistake in every which way. In 2017, Chad Daybell and Melanie Gibb meet in Ogden, Utah, where Chad is selling his books and giving a talk. Melanie is a co-host on a podcast with Lori at this point. Also participating in the podcast are Melanie Gibb's boyfriend, David Warwick, and a guy named Jason Mao, who worked as a police officer in Arizona until an injury put him out of commission. July 11th of 2017, Lori and Charles are looking for a special school in Arizona for JJ. It's a school for kids with various needs, as well as physical, intellectual, and mental health challenges. In December of 2017, Charles arranges for JJ to get a service dog. You get the feeling that Charles was doing everything in his power to ensure that JJ realized his full potential and that he was a very happy child. When JJ gets his new golden doodle named Bailey, he sleeps through the night for the very first time in a very long time. In January of 2018, Lori's son Colby gets married to a young woman named Kelsey. Colby has said that at this point, everything with the family seemed normal and everyone was happy. Colby also explains that while Lori and Charles had occasional arguments, the fights weren't huge. Colby also tells Keith Morrison of Dateline that when he married Kelsey, his mom Lori suddenly started acting like she was in competition with Kelsey. Colby also told Keith Morrison that his mom treated him more like a boyfriend than a son. Colby noticed that in 2018, his mom was hanging out a lot more with her brother Alex, and they were getting very close very fast. It would appear that they were bonding over their fascination with all this end of times and doomsday stuff. In February of 2018, Lori's friend Melanie Gibb becomes Zulema Pastinas' visiting teacher. It's through Gibb that Zulema meets Lori and Alex. You may recall that Zulema will later marry Alex Cox, and they will be together as husband and wife for just 13 days because Alex suddenly dies in December of 2019. Now on April 3rd of 2018, Tylee's father, Joe Ryan, is found deceased in his apartment. The medical examiner's office rules that Ryan died of natural causes from a heart attack. Tragically, Ryan was deceased in his apartment for several days before anyone realized it, and in fact, Lori was the person who was contacted to make decisions about Ryan's body. Apparently, her name was still listed on Joe's legal documents as his next of kin. Lori immediately arranges for Joe to be cremated. Joe's sister, Annie Cushing, doesn't find out about her brother's death until 5 weeks after the fact. Lori didn't have the decency to contact Annie, whom she knew and had gotten along with. Joe Ryan's death will later be revisited after Annie Cushing releases an audio recording of a podcast in which Lori Vallow is speaking to a religious group about her custody battle with Joe Ryan. In that recording, Lori is heard saying this about Ryan: "I was going to murder him. I was going to kill him like the scriptures say." End quote. The second investigation by the Phoenix police concludes that the originally listed cause of death, a heart attack, was correct. But again, Joe's body had been cremated, so they didn't have the opportunity to do a second autopsy on it. Lori also tells a family member after Joe's death that he was evil and therefore God took care of him. Note that Ryan had life insurance and Lori received that payout after his death. Although she said she was going to share it with Tylee, it's unclear if she ever followed through on that. Here's a sad detail. Police released photos of Joe Ryan's sparsely furnished apartment after his death, and on every shelf of an étagère, there were photos of Tylee. Joe clearly loved his daughter. If only he could have realized what Lori was capable of before Tylee went missing. If only he'd taken over as Tylee's full-time parent when Lori offered that up. But there again, I go with my if-onlys. And also found in Joe's apartment post his death was a pair of women's sunglasses. They were on the bathroom counter. Now, who could those have belonged to? Some people, including Annie Cushing, think it's possible that the glasses might belong to Lori. Even though Ryan's death was deemed due to natural causes, you have to wonder if somehow Lori was involved. I mean, she had motive, which was to get her hands on the life insurance money. And we know she despised him, and we know she's capable of evil. In May of 2018, so 1 month after Joe was discovered deceased, Lori invites Annie Cushing to visit Tylee, and Annie accepts. After the visit, Annie texts her daughter to say that the trip was absolutely exhausting. She tells her daughter that she heard Lori telling many lies, and I'm assuming many of these were about Joe. Annie also witnessed Lori speaking ill of Joe in front of his daughter Tylee. Every parent who cares about their kids' emotional health knows that it's a big no-no to do that. Annie also expresses that she felt Lori was unhinged and untethered from the truth at this point, and that she saw a dark side of Lori during the visit that made her question some of Lori's claims. Annie confides in her daughter that Lori may be a sociopath and way more than that, and she says she regrets going for the visit. Annie expresses as well that she felt Lori was discouraging Tylee from mourning her father. Annie notes as well that Lori was obsessing about the end of times. Jump to October of 2018. This is when Lori and Chad first locked eyes, and by all accounts, it was an electrifying moment for each one of them. That meeting took place at a religious conference in St. George, Utah, and Chad was there to give a talk about his near-death experiences as well as the end of times. Chad expressed his belief that the end of times were imminent and that people needed to prepare for them. Chad was also at the conference to sell his books. Lori was already familiar with Chad's books, and according to her friend April Raymond, Lori was a super fan of Chad's. In these small religious circles, Chad was something of a celebrity because of his books and his talks. Video footage from that event captured Chad speaking and Lori in the audience listening. Melanie Gibb was there to witness Lori's reactions to Chad and his to her. From what Gibb said, it was almost like le coup de foudre, or love at first sight, for Chad and for Lori. Chad will later write a romantic tale, or what's supposed to sound like a romantic tale, about that first meeting, and in it he will describe Lori as being beautiful and vivacious, and how he was thrilled that this beautiful woman was interested in talking to him and hearing what he had to say. The two quickly bond over all this doomsday stuff. One of Lori's friends said that she, Lori, was 100% into the end of times, and she would constantly warn her friends that they needed to prepare for it. Lori was also said to be ordering things all the time to ensure that she had everything she needed for her food storage and her supplies for the end of times. Lori was convinced that she would be among the 144,000 faithful Christians who would be resurrected to heaven as immortal spirits. Annie Cushing also said that Lori once let this slip, and I quote, "It's going to be the end of the world, and we should just all drive off a cliff with our kids and die at the same time," end quote. Scary thing for anyone to say, but especially for a mother. Soon Chad and Lori make their first appearance together on Preparing the People podcast, and it's called Time to Warrior Up. The two go on to appear on several more podcasts together, most of which are talking about the end of the world. According to a felony indictment, it is on October 26 of 2018 that Lori and Chad begin discussing their religious beliefs in order to justify taking the lives of Charles Vallow, Tammy Daybell, J.J. Vallow, and Tylee Ryan. Clearly, it wasn't long after meeting that Chad and Lori began conspiring in their evil plot. Anyone who would have been in the way of the two getting married and living as husband and wife had to go. So that meant Charles Vallow had to go, Tammy Daybell had to go, and Lori's minor children also had to go. What's interesting is that none of Chad Daybell's kids needed to be gone. Why was that? In the next episode, we'll discuss the tragic events that transpired in 2019 and that led to Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell's marriage and subsequent arrests. I hope you'll join me for that. Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories, hey, do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe to my channel, leave me a comment, and I'll see you next time.
Being a good mom is very important to me, and a good wife, and a good worker, and being all those things together is not easy. So I'm basically a ticking time bomb.
Had something that you knew was the right thing to do, but it turns out that later on it was a felony. This is a true story. I thought that my ex-brother-in-law was a pedophile. So I took a stun gun and I discharged it right in his nutsack.